Howdy, y'all. A couple weeks ago, I was scrolling through YouTube when I saw a premiere for a PragerU video that I instantly knew I would have to talk about. That video was A Short History of Slavery, presented by Candace Owens. Now, this video is not a fresh conservative take on the subject. In fact, the video is essentially a more focused version of a chapter from Candace's book. I say the video is more focused because in the book, Candace talks about slavery for 10 pages and then spends the next 20 complaining about the media, Democrats, and Antifa. But while it doesn't really say anything new, I think it's still worth taking a look at because unfortunately, many of the ideas espoused in this video are commonly held beliefs among the right. Commonly held beliefs that do not hold up well under scrutiny.
And now for a brief history of slavery. Here's the first thing you need to know. Slavery was not invented by white people. It did not start in 1619 when the first slaves came to Jamestown. It existed before then. It did not start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion, served them for dinner.
Now, right off the bat, I feel it's important to note that Candace is arguing against a point that nobody is making. Nobody is claiming that slavery began in the Americas. Now, many will claim that slavery in the Americas was uniquely horrid, and we will be getting to that later. But for now, let's examine the claims about Columbus. Longtime viewers of the channel will know that I've previously spoken about Columbus and his interactions with the Taino and Carib tribes, link in the description. But I was unfamiliar with this claim of the Taino asking for help from the Caribs enslaving them. I would have liked to have known more, but PragerU's source for this claim leads to a 404 page. Now, I could just assume this means the claim is bogus, but that would be pretty intellectually dishonest, and I don't want to be like Candace here, so I went looking for information. I was referred to the book The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America, by Dr. Andres Resendez. Unfortunately, I still couldn't find any evidence to PragerU's claim, but I was able to find some interesting information. For the sake of generosity, let's operate under the assumption that what Candace says is true, that the Taino did indeed approach Columbus seeking help with the Caribs who were enslaving them. There's no provided evidence for this, and it's probably a lie, but with what we're about to go over, it doesn't really matter. So in the Caribbean, in order for European slavers to capture slaves, they needed to obtain a license from the crown. Enslaving Indians was technically prohibited by the crown, but there were 3 exceptions where it was allowed. Indians who engaged in cannibalism were permitted to be enslaved. Indians captured in, big air quotes here, just wars, were also fair game. And if an Indian were enslaved by other Indians, the colonists could ransom or buy them to take as their own slaves. So the Europeans didn't exactly help out any enslaved natives. The Taino's supposed pleas were met with them being wiped off the face of the earth. But one thing that caught my attention was that some scholars have said that these rules may have led the colonists to exaggerate or manufacture claims of cannibalism in order to justify slave raids. A Spanish judge in 1518 said that many slaving parties were
taking Indians from the Barbados, the Gigantes, and elsewhere, who are not Caribs nor proper to be slaves.
Now it is true that cannibalism was practiced in parts of the New World, but just like today how conservatives inflate it to soften the atrocities committed by Europeans, those Europeans themselves inflated it to commit their atrocities. Not really a fun fact, but it happened.
Slavery existed in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The word slave actually comes from the Slavs of Eastern Europe. Millions of them, all white by the way, were captured and enslaved by Muslims in the 9th century and later by the Ottoman Turks. Slavery existed when the Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and most of Europe from the 1st through the 5th centuries. Slavery existed when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the 4th century BC. It was so common that Aristotle simply considered it natural. The slave-master model was just how the world operated in the great philosopher's day. Slavery existed during the time of the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. As far back as we can go in human history, we find slavery.
But everyone else was doing it is such a weak excuse that the response to it is literally one of the most cliched phrases in the English language. Now, it's true that slavery existed in all of these societies, but it's also true that it did not look the same in all of these societies. In fact, in the Ottoman Empire, slavery was comparably far more lenient. Male slaves were typically conscripted for military work, while female slaves were used as domestic servants and afforded some basic civil rights, such as leisure time and a degree of free speech and action. Domestic slavery was also a temporary position, with the enslaved serving for only 7 to 9 years, after which they could either stay with the family that owned them or request to be married, where they would be given wedding clothes, jewelry, and potentially even their own house. In this society, slavery served somewhat as a vehicle of upward mobility. And while no slavery is good, slavery in the Americas was exceptional in its cruelty. For the sake of brevity, let's just compare how slavery worked in the Americas with how it worked in West African societies. I selected West Africa because African participation in the institution of slavery is often used to say,
well, Africa wasn't so innocent.
Indeed, we'll soon hear Candace put forth a version of that argument, but as we'll soon see, these two systems are hardly equivalent. Now in West Africa, the way one became a slave was through being a war captive, a debtor, or committing a serious crime. In the American system, one became a slave by being captured, marched to shore, imprisoned until a slave ship arrived, shipped across the ocean, and sold at market, upon which, if they survived the journey, they would be subject to harsh, difficult, and often deadly labor, such as working in the mines and harvesting sugarcane. In fact, one plantation owner, Edward Littleton, estimated that
a sugar planter who owned 100 slaves and employed them in growing and processing sugarcane would kill them all in 19 years.
In comparison, Olada Ekwano, an African man who experienced slavery in both Africa and European colonies, said that slaves in Africa do
no more work than any other member of the community, including their master. Their food, clothing, and lodging were nearly the same as theirs, except they were not permitted to eat with the freeborn.
Slaves were also afforded some civic and civil rights. They could educate themselves, they could usually marry and raise children, and they could often accrue wealth. African slavery also differed in that there were pathways out of slavery. One could become free by bearing a free man's child through marriage or via manumission, a legal process through which slave owners could grant their slaves freedom. But the most important distinction between slavery in Africa and in the Americas is that African slavery was not a racial or hereditary system. Nobody was automatically a slave because of their race, and those born to slave mothers were not themselves slaves. This meant no permanent slave class ever existed in Africa, unlike the Americas, where the children of slaves were slaves from birth, and black people were a permanent underclass. Now that we've heard Candace misrepresent the history regarding slavery, let's listen to her straight up lie about it.
Here's the second thing you need to know. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies. Then, of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution. After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice. That includes the 300,000 Union soldiers, overwhelmingly white, who died during the Civil War. Now, am I saying that this makes white people better than anyone else? Of course not. My purpose here is to simply tell the truth, and the truth is that human history is complicated. No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless.
Now, it's a good thing that I research and script out these videos in advance, because if this were a live reaction, I'd be tossing out some rather unsavory language right about here. Britain was far from the first country to abolish slavery. As far as I can tell, the first country to formally abolish slavery was Japan in 1590 under the rule of Emperor Toyotomi Hideyoshi. However, this could be argued as not counting because, like we discussed, slavery looked different in different places. And Japan briefly had state-facilitated sex slavery during World War II. So yeah. Regardless of this, Britain was still not the first country to abolish slavery, as the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1803 saw abolition and the overthrow of French colonial power when enslaved, free, and marooned Africans overthrew their French masters and established their own nation. And then, in 1825, the French pulled up with warships and demanded $21 billion in reparations, because, as we've learned throughout history, slave owners are sore losers. This presentation of events is also misleading in other ways. Candace pretty much erases the work of African Americans, who accounted for about 40,000 of those Union deaths she is so proud to attribute to white people. Candace also ignores the work of black abolitionists here, people like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Octavius Catto, Sarah Parker Resmond, David Ruggles, and many more. These people were not only crucial to getting Lincoln into the White House, but also pushing him towards abolition once he was. To pretend the abolition movement was solely the work of white men is morally bankrupt.
Yet today we are never told to consider the murderous Persian Empire or the cannibalism of indigenous tribes of North and South America or the heinous actions under the imperialistic Muslim, Chinese, Mongol, or Japanese empires, to name just a few. Instead, we're told that slavery is a white phenomenon.
Once again, I'll have to contest that Candace is manufacturing a straw man to argue against. Nobody is claiming that the Atlantic slave trade was the only instance of slavery in history, and any history class that covers the Muslim world, China, the Mongols, Japan, or anywhere else is going to talk about the bad stuff that happened there. But when we're discussing the history of the Americas, this stuff isn't exactly relevant. You wouldn't go into a talk on the Armenian genocide saying, well, how come you're not talking about the Holocaust? It seems less like you're actually interested in discussing all of these ideas, and more like you just want to stop talking about this one, which is what she wants, but more on that later.
And like all persistent lies, this lie spawns a bunch of other lies. On social media, I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true, but it's not. It's a fantasy. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their black partners to bring them black bodies. The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors.
Did you catch that? Candace pulled a sneaky little rhetorical trick there. She brought up the claim that Africans lived like pharaohs, claimed it was a fantasy, and then started talking about a completely separate point on Africans selling each other into slavery, as if that disproves the claim Africans lived like pharaohs. Now we'll get to the latter point in a bit, but for now, I want to talk a bit about ancient African civilization. Now, is it fair for people of African descent to see themselves as descended from great pharaohs? I'd say it has about as much, if not more, historical legitimacy as those with European descent seeing themselves as descended from kings. African societies weren't some backwater land of savages, as is so often portrayed, but rather consistently some of the most advanced societies in the world. Now, obviously, there was Egypt. Just one of the oldest and longest lasting civilizations in the entirety of human history. Now, whether or not Egypt can truly be considered an African civilization is the subject of some debate, mostly among people who have never looked at a map. As for the notion that ancient Egyptians weren't really black, they probably wouldn't consider themselves black because they lived before the modern concept of race was a thing, but their Greek contemporaries described them as black-skinned with woolly hair. The idea that they were actually white is just a narrative pushed by 19th century skull enthusiasts who wanted to perpetuate the idea of white supremacy. But unlike every history class when discussing Africa, I don't just want to talk about Egypt, so let's look at some other African societies. For artistic innovation, there were the Nok people, who live in what is now Nigeria. They're known for these stylized terracotta sculptures. And then there's the Benin bronzes, some of the coolest metalworking art of the entire ancient world, which was then stolen by the British. Yeah. You're probably a bit familiar with the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires, but the significance of them often gets overlooked. While Europe was in the Dark Ages, Mansa Musa was heading over to Mecca with a literal ton of gold. 2, in fact, and Timbuktu was the place for Islamic scholarship with its universities and libraries. So should people of African descent see themselves as pharaohs and kings? No, nobody should idolize monarchy. But their claim to doing so is as legitimate as any white person's. Now, on this idea that Africans sold their own people into slavery, no, they didn't. Pan-Africanism isn't a thing at this point in time. In fact, stuff like Pan-Africanism and the singular American Indian identity developed primarily as a response to colonialism. But the Africans participating in the Atlantic slave trade were selling people from different factions, often ones who they were or had been in conflict with. And while the items they were sold for were sometimes what we'd consider trivial today, such as mirrors or manillas, they were also sold for stuff like guns. And when your enemy is selling you off for guns and you don't have any, you'll probably want to sell them to get some guns too. I don't know, that's just my take as someone who enjoys not getting shot.
Here's the third thing you need to know. If you think slavery is a relic of the past, you're wrong. There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today, right now. That's the lowest estimate that I could find. Other sources say there are many more. For context, that's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States. Child soldiers, human trafficking, forced labor, these are the conditions that currently exist within the same sub-Saharan region where the transatlantic slave trade originated. African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then, and no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men. In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries.
Okay, first off, the context Candace provides needs some context, because just saying 380,000 Africans were shipped to North America kind of downplays the scale of the Atlantic slave trade, because there were 12.5 million transported to the Americas as slaves, not to mention the millions more that died on the journey. And while a relatively small amount wound up in the US, I'm not sure how to put this, but people make babies. So there were 4 million slaves in the South before the Civil War. And then there's the fact that this all happened when the world population was 8 times smaller. That's not to downplay modern slavery. It is horrendous. I just don't care for Candace trying to use it to pretend historical slavery was no big deal. As for the notion that slavery is exclusively practiced in non-white countries today, let's take a look at the 13th Amendment. Putting on my best founding father voice for this one.
Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
Of all the amendments you'd want to have exceptions, it really shouldn't be the one abolishing slavery. But yeah, unfortunately, the 13th Amendment is not as ironclad in abolition of slavery as is often taught. It leaves the door wide open for using prisoners as slave labor. And this isn't some purely theoretical thing that doesn't happen in real life, like trickle-down economics. No, prison slavery has been a major practice in U.S. prisons since it became illegal to do out of prison. After the passage of the 13th Amendment, there was a surge of incarcerations of Black Americans, spurred by the creation of Black Codes, which were laws outlawing behaviors common to Black people, such as walking without a purpose, walking at night, hunting on Sundays, or settling on public or private land. If walking without a purpose sounds pretty vague to you, that's because it totally is. It's almost like these laws were only an excuse to lock up Black people. Anyways, once incarcerated, prisoners would be forced to work. They could be put on a state farm and made to pick cotton, put on a chain gang. Many were even rented out to private companies and made to do whatever the company wanted. There was minimal concern for their well-being. If a prison worker died, they would just be replaced after all. But this system is not a relic of the past. It's slightly better now, but barely. And prison labor in the US is now a billion-dollar industry. This has been fueled by the mass incarceration policies of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and is a contributing factor to the disproportionate representation of African Americans in US prisons. In the United States today, prisoners are forced to do often demeaning, often dangerous work for little to no pay. They have been barred from forming unions, despite the right to unionize being present in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Refusal to work is often met with harsh treatment, with activists such as Kevin Rashid Johnson speaking out about how they have been beaten, starved, and placed in solitary confinement for their refusal. Now, this is not to say that prison labor is inherently monstrous. It has its place. Many prisoners do want to work, after all. But there is a difference between voluntary prison labor and prison slavery. Prisoners need fair wages, the right to unionize, and the ability to consent to work freely, instead of being forced or coerced into doing so. And until then, we cannot claim that slavery is a relic of America's past.
But we hear almost nothing about that. Just like we hear nothing about how slavery was universal until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago. Why? Because our so-called leaders, Black and white, wouldn't profit from it. Black victimhood is nothing if not profitable. It elects politicians and funds racial grievance groups. And if Black Americans began to view themselves as partners in the American dream, if we embraced the patriotic spirit that holds all men are created equal, the patriotic spirit that is our real heritage, then the race hustlers would soon be out of business. And who wants that? I'm Candace Owens, author of Blackout for Prager University.
I cannot stress enough how funny it is for Candace to claim Black victimhood is profitable when she's made millions of dollars saying racism doesn't exist. There are dozens of Black conservative pundits and politicians running with this narrative, and it's working out great for them. As for the idea that politicians and racial grievance groups are manufacturing a problem where one doesn't exist, this attack has been aimed at virtually every civil rights movement in American history. You know, maybe the reason they keep talking about these issues is because these are issues that negatively impact millions of Americans. It should be pretty clear by now that the purpose of this PragerU video was not to talk about the history of slavery. Rather, this video exists because people like Candace want us to stop talking about slavery. This becomes even more clear when we read her book. Now, I haven't read the whole thing because I don't hate myself quite that much, but I did get a copy from the library to read the chapter on slavery. A lot of what she says in the book is repeated in the video, but the book starts differently. Instead of starting by just going into a deceptive history of slavery, the chapter begins as a response to calls for slavery reparations, where Candace claims it's highly implausible that slavery has lingering effects 400 years later. Yeah, I guess she's not great with how time works. But it becomes abundantly clear her mission is to stop the conversation on reparations. To this end, she'll misrepresent the past, lie about the present, and even call the other side racist, despite
You just label everything racist.
being a favorite talking point of the right. There's several pages of her talking about the Democrat plantation in here, and like everyone pushing that narrative, she summarily ignores most of the 20th century and Southern strategy. Can't let historical fact interfere with propaganda, after all. I think this sort of thing would qualify as race hustling, but that's a pretty gross term that's been used to drag African Americans for pushing for civil rights, so instead, let's just call it what it is: being a dishonest hack. She claims her purpose here is simply to tell the truth, but it's not. This video is a pushback against a truth that she hates. Slavery was and continues to be a major issue in this country. It doesn't have to be. We could abolish it entirely and implement policies to address the legacy of it. But Candace, PragerU, and the conservative movement at large don't want that to happen. Whether through ignorance or malice, they're clinging to the delusion that systemic issues will go away if we just ignore them and all sing "God Bless America" around the flag or something. The key to combating these misconceptions is to be honest about slavery. Never omit it from a U.S. history class. Never sanitize the atrocity. Never ignore its modern legacy. Because when the people are educated on something, the job of shameless grifters becomes near impossible. Thanks for watching. Sorry this video took so long to come out. I moved to university at the end of August, and it's been rough getting acclimated to making videos in this environment. Like, I'm actually recording this audio right now in an empty classroom, probably why it sounds so bad. This video also was supposed to be a different PragerU response about their video on sports, but that one I got writer's block, so I moved over to this one, which was a bitch to research. Like, I read 3 books, dozens of articles, so many freaking accounts of slaves getting raped. And oh my god, yo, Thomas Jefferson, what a tool. As I'm recording this right now, the channel has just passed 500 subscribers, which I think is pretty crazy. Like, for YouTube standards, it doesn't seem like that much, but when I think about it, it's like 500 people attending, a lecture class held by me. It's just, boggles my mind. I'm not gonna start a Patreon or anything, at least not for a while. But if you would like to support the channel, you can share, comment, subscribe, like, all that stuff. Hit the freaking bell. But thank you. Like, honestly.